Every person alive today is a descendant of the same small group of humans. Modern humans have less genetic diversity than chimpanzees, which is a species a fraction of the size of our current population. That shouldn't be possible unless something reduced the human population so severely at some point that almost everything died, and only the descendants of a tiny surviving group made it forward. It's what geneticists call a bottleneck, and the evidence is, well, it's in the DNA of every person on Earth. But what caused it and whether whoever survived was chosen rather than lucky is one of those open questions in human prehistory. For a long time, the answer seemed obvious. 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano in what is now Sumatra, Indonesia, erupted with a force that makes every other volcanic event in recorded human history look minuscule. The Toba eruption ejected 2,800 cubic kilometers of ash into the atmosphere, more than 10,000 times the size of the 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption. The ash cloud spread across the entire planet, and the main thought was that it triggered years of volcanic winter, black skies, global cooling, and the collapse of food sources worldwide. The theory was that Toba nearly ended humanity, and the genetic bottleneck was the scar that it left behind. A population that may have been in the hundreds of thousands reduced to fewer than 10,000 individuals, with only their descendants surviving to become everyone that's alive today. But then archaeologists started finding things that just didn't fit into that box. The places researchers looked at were sites spanning the Toba eruption period, South Africa, Ethiopia, India, parts of Asia. What they found was humans persisting rather than collapsing. The theory of a collapse just wasn't showing up in the evidence, and then in 2026, ScienceDaily stated that as the evidence accumulates, it appears that people were able to survive and continue being productive after Toba blew its stack. The climate modeling has also been weakened. More recent simulations show the volcanic winter may have been less severe than originally calculated, especially in Africa where modern humans were concentrated. Vegetation records from East African lake sediments show limited disruption around 74,000 years ago. And the genetic picture also got a little bit stranger. Recent analysis shows the low diversity in modern human DNA may have been building for longer than Toba's timeline, possibly starting at 100,000 to 150,000 years ago, well before the eruption. Toba didn't cause the bottleneck. Something else reduced human population so severely that genetic diversity of an entire species was nearly eliminated. And whatever it was already in process before the largest volcanic eruption in 2.5 million years. Right around the same time as the bottleneck, something changed in human behavior, so much so that archaeologists call it the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. Stone tools had remained pretty much unchanged for 300,000 years. Then in a window that looks very abrupt, everything shifted. Art appeared, cave paintings, abstract symbols that had no precursor in anything that came before, long-distance trade, sophisticated weapons, music, personal ornamentation. The same species that had been making the same basic tools for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly started doing everything that would come to define modern human culture, all in a window that coincides with one of the most severe population reductions in the species' history. A lot of people say that humans have always had that cognitive capacity and that there's no evidence that could survive long enough for us to prove it. And maybe that's the case, but that still doesn't explain the behavioral revolution and the bottleneck overlap in the timeline, or why the specific genetic changes that separate modern humans from every other hominid appear to have been selected for in that same window. Human-accelerated regions, the sequences that rewrote themselves in genes controlling brain development and cognitive function, and that occurred only in humans and no other species, are in every person alive. Every lineage that passed through the bottleneck carried them. Whatever the bottleneck was, it's selected for those sequences. There's also something about what every ancient tradition says when it describes a major population reduction. They describe it as deliberate. The Sumerian Atrahasis epic, the oldest flood narrative in written history, describes a council of beings deciding to reduce the human population, a single family selected and preserved, and specific instructions given to the survivors. The biblical flood follows the same structure, as do the Mesopotamian traditions. One family carried through while the rest of humanity ended. The Book of Enoch describes beings who crossed into physical reality, produced a hybrid population that grew uncontrollable, and a reset that brought it back to a manageable number of specifically selected survivors. The Hopi describe multiple worlds preceding this one, each populated, each reset when it reached a specific point, each time a small group preserved to begin what came next. What runs through all those is the same structure. The reduction was intentional, the survivors were chosen, and the world that emerged from it was different from the one that was there before. The last video on this channel covered the University of Virginia's 2,500 case database of children who remember previous lives. Ian Stevenson spent 40 years on this, children naming families that they never met, describing deaths that they never witnessed, born with birthmarks matching wounds confirmed by autopsy reports. The filter that suppresses those memories engages between ages 5 and 7 as the brain's architecture installs itself. The pineal calcification, the shift from theta brainwaves to beta dominance, the closure of access to the states where past life memory and gateway-style consciousness work operate. This happens as the developing brain settles into the cognitive profile that every modern human carries universally. But what if that filter wasn't always there? What if the humans alive before the bottleneck lived a fundamentally different relationship with consciousness, able to remember previous lives the way children do before the filter engages, naturally accessing theta states where Monroe's gateway research and Strassman's DMT trials live, with a direct relationship to the consciousness layer that physics is now only beginning to describe with math? And what if whatever managed that reduction decided that that specific capability was the thing that needed to be controlled? The children Stevenson documented might not be anomalies. They might be moments where an older genetic expression surfaces before the suppression catches up. A throwback to a cognitive profile that existed before the bottleneck narrowed who survived and what they carried through. The bottleneck wasn't just a population reduction, it was a cognitive reset. And the filter isn't a side effect of brain development, it's a record of who was allowed through. After Toba, regardless of where you place the bottleneck in the timeline, the survivors didn't collapse, they expanded. Researchers working in the Horn of Africa found that human populations there didn't decline after the eruption. They migrated. The ash layer marks a moment of movement, not contraction, people dispersing into new territories carrying modern human behavior with them. The Toba eruption should have ended humanity, but instead it produced the version of humanity that covers the planet today, carrying universal genetics, and a filter over consciousness that every modern human inherited from the same small group of survivors. Whoever made it through that window is everyone who has ever lived since. If the bottleneck was managed and the filter on past life memory was specifically selected for, what do you think the pre-bottleneck humans were accessing that made closing that door worth reducing an entire species to a few thousand survivors? If humans had more brain power and capacity to do things and access things that have been stifled for us today, the powers that be wouldn't have as much control and there would be no separation of powers. So there had to be a division, and is this how they went about creating it? If this was a designed population reduction that reduced our cognitive capabilities, the people that designed it and implemented it probably didn't have those same limited cognitive capabilities, or they didn't put them on themselves. So my thought is if they were starting this new population with this new set of survivors, they would have to come back and check on it from time to time to ensure that it's going the way that they planned. And if it wasn't, they would have to make changes, which aligns to a lot of stuff that we've covered in previous videos. And if someone did plan this and execute it and change our cognitive capabilities to make them remain superior, then we would view them as gods. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe, hit that like button. Love to read your comments on these, and I try to respond to them as many as physically possible. Until next time, I'll talk to you later.